Yemeni journalist Abdulelah Haider Shaye says one man is responsible for his nearly 3 years in prison. Why did President Obama personally intervene to ensure his incarceration? You're watching Inside Story Americas from Washington. Hello, I'm Shihab Ratansi. The news that the Obama administration has been monitoring journalists from the Associated Press and Fox News has been greeted with consternation by the U.S. media and civil liberties groups. But the plight of another journalist who received the personal attention of President Obama has received less coverage. Abdulelah Haider Shaye was initially imprisoned in 2010 after his reporting showed that the U.S. had conducted a missile strike in the village of Majala that killed 14 women and 21 children. The Yemeni government had claimed the credit for the attack. Shaye's jailing led to an outcry in Yemen, and it was reported that the country's president was considering his release. But following a personal phone call from President Obama, no pardon was issued. The U.S. has yet to provide any evidence that Shaye is connected to al-Qaeda. I'm joined from New York by Jeremy Scahill, national security correspondent for The Nation magazine. He's the author of Dirty Wars, which has also been made into a film, which is in the process of being released around the U.S. Here in the studio is Major General Paul Eaton. In a long career with the U.S. military, he commanded operations to train Iraqi troops between 2003 and 2004. He was an advisor to Hillary Clinton during her bid for the presidential nomination and subsequently was vocal in his support for Barack Obama's presidential campaign. Currently, he's a special advisor to the National Security Network. That's a think tank here in Washington, D.C. Jeremy Scahill, let's begin then with Abdulelah Shaye's case. A statement was released last week, May 28th. It was Shaye releasing a letter from prison, and he made it clear who he blames for his detention. Quote, "It's inaccurate to say the Americans imprisoned me because some of them defended and supported me and opposed my detention. Actually, the only person responsible for kidnapping and detaining me is Obama. So I don't want the media to say America or Americans have incarcerated me because it's obvious." Jeremy Scahill, that's what he had to say last week. Do we know how he is, how he's being treated at the moment?
Yeah, I mean, my understanding from people who have been to visit him recently is that he's really struggling to keep his sanity, that he spends much of his time either praying in his jail cell or being alone. He's only gotten a handful of visitors over the 3 years or so that he's been in prison in Yemen. And most major media freedom organizations around the world, human rights organizations, have condemned his incarceration, said that his trial, where he was accused of being an al-Qaeda facilitator, was a sham trial. In fact, I should point out, he was prosecuted in a court in Yemen that was specifically set up by the country's dictator at the time, Ali Abdullah Saleh, specifically to prosecute journalists who had committed crimes against the state. And basically, the dictator of Yemen would use this. He would throw journalists in prison, pile on charges against them, and then he would pardon them and release them. And it would sort of be like a threat. If you continue to do this, we're going to stick you back in. The difference in this case is that when Ali Abdullah Saleh was preparing to pardon Abdulelah Haider Shaye, he received this call from the White House, not from an underling at the White House, but from the President of the United States himself, saying that the United States was deeply concerned about his possible release. And in fact, just last week, the State Department reiterated that it is the U.S. position that he's dangerous and should be remaining in that prison cell in Yemen.
All right, so we asked for a statement from the Embassy of Yemen on Shaye's continued incarceration. This is all we got, quote, one line: "The Office of the General Prosecutor is reviewing his case." Is that cause for any hope? Might there be a chance for some movement on this?
Well, you know, a few weeks ago, the new president of Yemen, President Hadi, told some journalists that and human rights observers that he had planned to release Abdulelah Haider Shaye, and so you had this sort of flurry of reports that it was possible he was going to be released. Abdulelah Haider's family said no one has contacted them, and it seems to be that the Yemeni government, I think, clearly wants to release him, but it's very powerful pressure when you have the most powerful man in the world, the President of the United States, going on record saying that this man is dangerous and they want him kept in prison. So, Yemen is an incredibly poor, small country that is under tremendous pressure from the United States to cooperate in its ongoing war inside of Yemen. and depends tremendously on international aid. And so for Yemen to sort of defy the United States on this would be an extraordinary act. And I think that's part of why Abdulelah Haider Shaye remains in prison.
We also approached the State Department for comment. They actually said we should go to the White House because they said they are actually handling the specifics of the case. The White House hasn't got back to us. Although they did make a statement last week to the Huffington Post, we remain concerned about al-Shaye's potential early release due to his association with al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. That was from a White House spokesperson. But let's...
Can I,
yeah, go ahead.
Can I take on this issue of his association with al-Qaeda? You know, as far as I know from the extensive investigation I've done into this case, his association with al-Qaeda consists of having interviewed members of al-Qaeda. And I think that if people took a close look at the work of this journalist over many years, and he also did work for the Washington Post, for NBC News. He was frequently on Al Jazeera. He worked with ABC News in the United States as well. This was a guy who was asking very tough questions of, for instance, Anwar al-Awlaki, the American-born Yemeni cleric who was killed in a drone strike in September of 2011. And President Obama, 600 days after al-Awlaki was killed, finally came out and admitted that it was the United States that in fact killed him. Part of the reason that we know some of the most incendiary things that Anwar al-Awlaki said is because this journalist was interviewing him and asking him tough questions, challenging him on his praise, for instance, of the attempt to blow up an airplane over the city of Detroit on Christmas Day 2009. Abdulelah Haider Shaye, I would say his real crime was doing real journalism. Part of our job as journalists is to go to the people that we're told are the enemies and interview them and report on their side of the story. And it seems to me like he's been targeted for two reasons. One, because he was finding al-Qaeda leaders that the United States was hunting and couldn't find itself and interviewing them. And the United States, I think, was concerned that he was giving them a platform. I would say that he was doing real journalism. But secondly, President Obama began authorizing missile strikes in Yemen in December of 2009. And the first strike, as you mentioned at the top, against al-Majala was allegedly aimed at one al-Qaeda operative who may or may not have been killed in that airstrike, but a tremendous number of civilians were killed, 36 or so women and children. When I went to Abyan province where this happened, the missile parts are still strewn across the desert there. We hit them with Tomahawk cruise missiles and cluster bombs. And we had cell phone video from survivors that we obtained showing infants and body parts of children being pulled from the rubble. The United States did not take responsibility for that strike, and instead Yemen issued a press release saying its air forces had attacked an al-Qaeda training camp and killed 34 al-Qaeda operatives. Because this journalist went to the scene and took pictures of the missile parts, Amnesty International was able to get munitions experts to confirm that it had to be a United States strike. After he exposed that, he was arrested by Yemen's security forces, and his life was threatened, and he was beaten, and was told, if you continue to talk about this, we're going to put you in jail. He continued to report about this, continued to interview al-Qaeda figures and people like Anwar al-Awlaki, and eventually his house was raided in the middle of the night. He was disappeared for 30 days, and then brought into this special tribunal to prosecute journalists in a cage, and then sentenced to 5 years in prison. I think that he's a political prisoner because his true crime seems to have been his expressions and his journalism.
And I suppose that point you make about cruise missiles and cluster bombs is quite an interesting reminder, though, that these covert wars of the Obama administration aren't just about drones, that the debate should be perhaps more about the whole approach to killing people as opposed to the new technology that's being employed.
Yeah, I mean, I think that part of the focus on drones is really sort of off base because, there's very little new in war except technology. And I think that if the United States wasn't using drones, it could be using cruise missiles. It could do other forms of airstrike using conventional aircraft. Already the United States uses AC-130s in battle. In Somalia, for instance, when one of the heads of al-Qaeda in East Africa was killed, he was killed by a team from JSOC, the Joint Special Operations Command. Initially, he was gunned down in a helicopter attack, and then Special Operations Forces landed inside of Somalia, took custody of the body of Salih Ali Nabhan, and then flew it out to a ship in the ocean off the coast of Somalia. So there's a full spectrum of weapons that are used. I understand why people have concerns about the potential for drones to be used domestically and the idea that, if you have a pilot sitting in the southwest of the United States and he's piloting an aircraft that has no human being in it and there's bombings happening of Yemen or Pakistan, the sort of sanitization of war and the video gamization of war creates some really profound questions about the democratic process. But focusing on the technology at the expense of looking at the policy, I think, is misguided.
Before I bring the Major General in, I just want to read one last thing from Shaye. At his trial, he said the following, quote, "When they hid murderers of children and women in Abyan, when I revealed the locations and camps of nomads and civilians in Abyan, Shabwa, and Ahab, when they were going to be hit by cruise missiles, it was on that day that they decided to arrest me. You notice in the court how they have turned all of my journalistic contributions into accusations. All of my journalistic contributions and quotations to international reporters and news channels have been turned into accusations. Yemen, this is the place where when a young journalist becomes successful, he's viewed with suspicion." Jeremy, I mean, it's just a pretty poignant statement, especially at this time when there's a discussion underway here in the US about whether journalists and whistleblowers are spies or aiding the enemy or simply doing their duty.
Right, and I mean, I in my work as a journalist, I mean, I meet with people who are sworn enemies of the United States, and I interview them because I think that's the role of journalists. And I think that what Abdulelah Haider Shaye was doing was engaging in the kind of journalism that we need more of in our world. Look, if not to give the CIA unsolicited advice on how to run its business, but if I were a U.S. intelligence operative and I was looking at Yemen, I wouldn't want Abdulelah Haider Shaye in prison. I would want him out in the field interviewing these people so we can understand their perspective. If these truly are enemies of the United States, then we want as much information as we can obtain about them. And I think that putting him in prison ultimately, I think, is counterproductive to the U.S. ability to understand the people that it is declaring as enemies of the United States. And I think he was doing a public service by going and actually interviewing these people. So, I've been fierce in my defense of him, and it baffles me why the powerful U.S. media organizations who were very happy to run his interviews with Anwar al-Awlaki and others have been totally silent in the face of his imprisonment.
Major General, I mean, a lot of issues there then to think about.
Absolutely.
First of all then, there is that point though, that there's an irony that by locking up journalists with access to the enemy, the administration itself has less information about the enemy. And it's not as if they've seemed terribly knowledgeable about what's going on in Yemen in the first place. But is there that assumption, though, that there won't be journalists who will investigate the claims being made, that you can leave Tomahawk missiles strewn across the desert floor because either we're going to get people to lock them up or I mean, there's just an assumption, though, that it doesn't really matter, this aspect.
Journalistic freedom, assured by the U.S. First Amendment, is vital to the good order and discipline of a democracy. Absolutely vital. So we need to encourage our journalists to be as dynamic as they can possibly be, to bring out the story, to render transparency where there's a lot of fog of war, if you will. So protecting our journalists at home and abroad is critical to the foreign policy of the United States, one. Two, I am absolutely, and I work with organizations, we are advocates for fair trial. This idea of indefinite detention or a false imprisonment after a questionable trial is something that is antithetical to the democracy that the United States stands by.
But your sense of democracy, clearly not President Obama's sense of that democracy.
Well, I don't have any particulars in this case, and what I will say is, at the end of the day, and I understand Jeremy's point on the throw weight that the United States has and that the President of the United States has, but at the end of the day, Yemen is a sovereign state, and the President of Yemen is held accountable for the decisions that he renders. So we encourage the transparency
with well-timed phone calls.
Yes, but I do not have the particulars and I cannot comment.
But should, I mean, just as an outside observer then, with a great deal of knowledge of the inside, Major General, then should we, I mean, how can we not take this as a warning to those trying to uncover the covert wars of the Obama administration not to do so?
I am uncomfortable when heads of state intervene into the affairs of another state. I hold states and their sovereignty extraordinarily important, and I am uncomfortable when we get in the business of intervening in the good order and discipline and the promulgation of laws and the Constitution of another state.
Right.
I'll leave it at that.
But that's what President Obama is doing, and you support President Obama.
If I accept at face value what Jeremy Scahill has just said, I have no basis to challenge it. I am uncomfortable with that kind of intervention.
Jeremy, did you take this as a warning? Should this be taken as a warning not to uncover the covert warfare of this administration at a time of unprecedented, perhaps, covert warfare by this administration?
Yeah, you know, I mean, there's sort of an unfortunate reality in Yemen and Pakistan where there's there's a sycophantic culture to journalism. And, you know, in Yemen, I saw it on the ground where you have regime journalists that are just, publish whatever the government says as fact, and these are sort of divinely chosen leaders. And then on the other hand, you have people that are journalists that are really sort of in the tank for al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. And what I thought was really remarkable about this guy who's in prison is that he was in nobody's tank. You know, he was really a fiercely independent guy. And to directly answer your question, it sent chills through the reporting community in Yemen, particularly of local reporters who now are sort of living in fear that if they do interviews with people that the United States has declared enemies, that they're also going to be thrown in prison. And I think that if you take that in concert with the recent actions that the Justice Department has taken against journalists in the United States, and you look at the fact that you have people that were whistleblowers in the U.S., from within the U.S. government, Thomas Drake, the former NSA official, they went after him and they tried to ruin him. And President Obama has been using the Espionage Act at a record rate, more than his predecessors over the past 100 years. And then you look at the fact that someone like Jose Rodriguez, who was one of the chief architects of the CIA's torture program after 9/11, he's running around on a book tour bragging about all of the torture that he helped to facilitate around the world. And President Obama saying, let's look forward and not backwards. I think in general, it sends a message that the U.S. is not interested in holding its own people accountable when they commit these acts. And at the same time, if you are a national security reporter and you are not just relying on official leaks from the administration, and you're actually talking to people independently, that there's risk for you to do so. I think that's a real crisis that all of us in a democratic society should be concerned about.
But let's widen the discussion then to the sort of activities that the government isn't terribly keen for journalists to be uncovering. And a big part of your book, Jeremy, and then the film that's just come out, is about the rise of JSOC, the Joint Special Operations Command, which appears to be the arm which the Obama administration uses to carry out many of these covert wars. Actually, do we know how many countries JSOC is operating in right now?
Well, look, I can answer that question about the number of countries, but I want to clarify or sort of give perspective to this. When we say that JSOC is operating in 75 to 100 countries around the world, it's actually Special Operations Forces, not necessarily JSOC. Good. So they're in 75 to 100 countries around the world. And in many of those countries, what these forces are doing is working alongside local special forces or special operations forces, training them, equipping them, and in some cases, and this is when it gets really muddied, they're going out on missions with them, at times kinetic operations, meaning that they're going out to either capture or kill people. So the vast majority of these operations around the world are in partnership with other militaries. But then, in a growing number of countries, we have discrete teams of Navy SEALs or Delta Force guys or Army Rangers that are actually conducting unilateral operations. And we've seen President Obama really embrace JSOC and its model as sort of the tip of the spear, particularly when it comes to his counterterrorism policy. So, I think we've seen under this administration a continuation of JSOC becoming an increasingly prominent player within the U.S. national security apparatus.
And very quickly, Jeremy, is this just about then counter-terror operations in inverted commas, or is it also about then drugs? Is it about protecting commercial interests? What is the scope?
There was a strike in Mexico a few weeks ago where the U.S. Special Operations Forces were working with the Mexican government to target drug cartels. This is happening in Colombia, it's happening in Mexico, and it's not just counterterrorism. I think that on the premier sort of crises of the day, we have an increasingly militarized response to it. And it's not like this is brand new. What I think is interesting is that you have President Obama, who is perceived by a lot of people to be a dovish candidate, really embracing this force and empowering them beyond Bush-era levels.
Major General, I mean, as someone who's, again, been within the national security establishment for some time, was this Obama's trajectory then, or was this a trajectory, was this bigger than him, basically? Was this how things were moving always then?
There's nothing bigger than the President of the United States, for one. But since 9/11, we have allowed this perpetual state of war to drive certain behaviors that are inconsistent, I think, with the good order and discipline, and I like those words quite a lot, obviously. We have combatant commands, and the entire planet is dedicated to our combatant commanders. Special Operations Command, the parent unit for JSOC, is not a combatant command, but exhibits behaviors that would lead us to believe they would like to become a combatant command. I do not agree with that. One, unity of command. Anything that happens with the military within a combatant command's area of operations, in this case, Central Command, has to be within the purview, known and transparent to the combatant commander.
Right.
Now, it also, whatever military action happens, say in the country of Mali or Yemen, the ambassador, the president's emissary, who works for the Secretary of State, the ambassador must be informed of what's going on within the borders of that country.
I wonder if the WikiLeaks cables have sort of shown us a slightly different hierarchy.
Well,
right now.
the WikiLeaks cable package is very helpful in illustrating there is a certain lack of transparency that we need to recapture.
But is there resistance? Are you suggesting there's resistance both within the State Department, obviously, but also within the military, that the JSOC and these special operations forces are taking much more of an unaccountable, untransparent role in these operations?
I do not have any knowledge of resistance. I have worked with special forces in the past. You need only go to Black Hawk Down to understand that there was a lot of parallel activity by the special operators and by the conventional operators, which created a disaster for the Ranger Regiment when we were not coordinated. Our conventional forces were not coordinated in order to support our special operators. So I'm a huge fan of unity of command, that we have one guy who knows all that's going on within the combatant command, and one guy who knows all that's happening militarily within the borders of the country in question.
Jeremy, in your reporting then, is that the kind of hierarchy that we're talking about here?
Well, I mean, I'm glad to hear Major General Eaton's comments, because I do think that his comments reflect what I hear from conventional military officers, non-special operations forces personnel. I think there's been a lot of consternation and concern since 9/11 that JSOC has operated in these areas of responsibility, these combatant commands that the Major General was speaking of, where they're going in, they're not coordinating with the CENTCOM commander or the SOUTHCOM commander. They are not informing the U.S. ambassador that they're going to be in the country. The home government is not aware of it, and they're showing up in pursuit of someone on their high-value targeting list. That creates all sorts of problems. It can create a huge diplomatic problem for the United States. It also can create a problem where you have U.S. forces that are not coordinated, and you've got conventional units that are in a country for one role, and then you have guys that are going in dark from special operations, and they do something that then creates blowback against the official U.S. forces. I think there's a great deal of concern. I mean, I found many examples over the past 10 or so years, 10, 12 years, of JSOC forces operating without going through the conventional chain of command.
Jeremy,
I'm not sure you're going to hear people speaking out against it, but I do know that there's concern within the military that this not continue.
Is all of this, Jeremy, unprecedented? The title of your book, even, Dirty Wars, is taken a little bit from the history of U.S. intervention in Latin America, the propping up of dictators, the squashing of democracy, at the very least sponsoring the torture and killing of innocents. Isn't this just a continuum of American exceptionalism in foreign policy? Is there anything new about any of this?
Well, part of why I called it Dirty Wars is because to push back on this notion that we're engaged in a cleaner form of warfare because we're using drones. My concern is, first of all, my answer is no, this is not new. My concern, though, is that because President Obama is who he is, constitutional law professor, Nobel Peace Prize winner, very popular, transformative character in American political history, that because he's creating systems to normalize and legitimize what I believe is primarily an assassination program, that this is going to have far-reaching implications. And the next time a Republican is in office, liberals are going to have very shaky ground to stand on in criticizing attempts to do these same kinds of actions. There's no such thing as Democratic cruise missiles or Republican cruise missiles. These are American cruise missiles.
Jeremy Scahill, thank you very much. Major General Paul Eaton, thank you as well.
My pleasure.
And that's all from the team in Washington, D.C. for now.